In this video, I show you these tiles from Azar Games. But before we get into today's video, just want to give a quick shout out to all of my lovely Patreon supporters. I love you guys so much. They make this channel what it is. And I also want to share Bob's picks for this past month's GGGGs. Each month, Bob the Beholder picks some of my Patreon supporters to receive gratitude gifts. And for this past month of June of 2023, Andrew C. and Greg D. received a $25 certificate for LV427. Josh H. and Martin L. received a pledge for the Zectonium Prison Mine Kickstarter. 80s Commander and Scott Lincoln received 2 pledges for the Bleak Elf Bastion. Seth P. and Giovanni S. received pledges for the Daco Quest Black Coast Citadel Kickstarter. Vincenzo F. and Tommy T. received pledges for the Frost City Kickstarter. And then Stephen P. received $100 to go towards the Tanaris Adventures Kickstarter that is going on right now. Thanks to all of my Patreon supporters for the love that they give this channel and for the support. Go ahead and use the link below to go to my Patreon page to find out what this month's GGGGs are going to be, as we're going to be adding to that list as the month goes along. I purchased these files a while ago now because I just love how cute this design is and totally reminds me of 16-bit or 32-bit Zelda games from my past. So mostly I didn't really have a game to use it for. It was mostly a nostalgic buy. I actually did print some of these out to use for Townsfolk Tussle. If you want to check out that video, go ahead and click here. But I've been looking for an excuse to print out the entire set, and finally that has come. Not because I have a game necessarily to go with it, but because more recently I got into Dungeon Blocks and I was able to adapt these tiles for Dungeon Blocks. If you haven't seen that video, go ahead and check it out here so that you can see the original set for Dungeon Blocks. And the original set from Florian for Azar Games is that these are 1-inch tiles. But in order for me to adapt it for the grid for Dungeon Blocks, I went ahead and increased everything and printed it at 125% size, so a little bit of a bump up in size. So these tiles are larger than 1 inch, which is something that I prefer anyway. But also, it does come with the ability to be able to take these tiles on and off of the peg, but it's on there pretty tight. So with the original set, I never really liked the system of sticking it onto the pegs, even though it was designed to be removable and interchangeable. It was somewhat difficult to do that. But the reason why I converted it was for 2 reasons. One, it's super easy, right? And just dropping these in and out to be able to make whatever configuration that you want. For example, I can just interchange this mushroom for a tree or what have you, and there's no messing around with a peg system that's difficult to use. The other reason why I switched to this system is so that I could do colored printing, because for the most part, almost all of my other terrain, and this includes the dungeon set from Dungeon Blocks, I just print everything in black PLA and then I just paint it whatever color that I want. So it doesn't really matter what PLA color that I use. My default is just black, just because when you scratch the paint off, it's really not noticeable when the black underneath shows through. But in this case, I wanted to sort of be able to skip that step of painting most of the terrain and just printing it out in the colors that I can get my hands in terms of PLA. So all of these bases, I did print them out in brown PLA, and as well most of these other pieces. For example, here I printed the base layer in green. All of the grasses in green I didn't paint, and then I used the function in Prusa Slicer where I added a layer so that my printer will automatically stop and beep, telling me to switch out the roll and then continue in a different color. So that's the feature that I used with a number of these files, was that leveled printing. And I also did convert some of the files. For example, these trees. Actually, I shrunk down the leaves part up here just because it was running into other trees when I set them side by side. But more importantly, I sliced off the top, the leaves part, so that I could do 2 layer printing, color printing with green for the grass and then brown for the trunk. And then I printed all of the leaves part up here separately. And because I didn't want to buy a whole nother roll of PLA that's a darker green, I went ahead and did spray paint all of these tops. I also did paint, sort of my traditional method, all of the buildings. Although if you did have gray PLA, which I didn't, you can just print all of the stone in gray and that would be fine. You wouldn't need to paint that. And I did also just paint up the doors and whatnot here. This mushroom house definitely does come in two parts so that you can print the top part in red and the bottom part in white. And I think that looks fine, but I did go ahead and paint these up as well. And then finally, these mushrooms, I did print 2-layer printing with white on top, but I did go back and paint the red and the white dots onto the mushrooms. So a lot of painting did actually go in, but I did save a lot of time by not needing to paint up any of the grass, some of the wood pieces I didn't have to paint. And one of the things that I really wish a creator would do is to make it possible so that, for example, this building in separate pieces so that you can just use brown PLA and print out all of the wood parts and then glue it onto a white base for the walls and then print the top part. Maybe just have a cover be in red and the chimney in gray and this part in brown. I know that there are printers like the Bamboo X1 with the AMS is able to do multicolor printing, but even if I had the AMS, which I don't, I would not do that because it wastes so much filament every time it needs to change a color for each level. Instead, what I'm looking for, here's an example, this Garfield that I printed out for my daughter's friend. Basically, you're printing out all of these orange pieces separately, and then this yellow piece was printed out with just yellow PLA, the white, etc., etc. So all the pieces are printed out separately so that you don't even have to do a mid-print swap, but you can print these pieces separately and then you glue them all together. And I wish that someone would design, for example, in this case where you want really bright colors, that you could just print out all of the gray pieces all at once and then maybe the blue piece separately for the roof, but including like the door here could be in brown PLA as well as these supports. So I wish there was a way to separate that out and then just assemble the pieces so that there was zero painting for all of these. But so far, I haven't seen any. If you have seen a designer do that with their terrain or buildings, go ahead and leave a comment in the comments below because I would love to see that design. But it wasn't too hard to be able to just paint up some of these buildings. I do a ton of painting, so at the end of the day, wasn't that big of a deal, but it would be fantastic to have a completely no paint option. That would be great. But overall, I think this looks awesome, and I am going to be using these files for Middara because, as I mentioned in my previous video with Dungeon Blocks, I am converting my previous set that I use high ground tiles to Dungeon Blocks, and so I wanted to be able to use this again for Middara as we continue on into Act 2. This set is really easy to put together because it uses these grids where you just, again, drop in all of these blocks, whatever configuration that you want, which is important for Middara because each square can be distinct and different. The other thing that I was really surprised by was that I was a little bit afraid by scaling this up to 125% that these multi-block sections, like this block here, wouldn't fit into the grid exactly. But I'm happy to say that it completely works, that the scaling is exactly right, going at 125%. Also, go ahead and go to my Patreon page and become a patron for just $1 if you want to know how I use Microsoft 3D Builder to create this base file so that you can put anything that you want on top of it. So that's a Patreon exclusive. Again, only costs $1 for you to be able to access that, as well as some of my other training videos on how to use Microsoft 3D Builder to convert the STLs that you have already purchased. The miniatures that you see here on the board is from the game Super Dungeon Explorer, which I haven't played in a super long time, but I just love these miniatures. I love the chibi minis that come with this game, as well as Arcadia Quest, which are the two games that use this chibi miniatures. But I just think it fits the aesthetic of the 16-bit or 32-bit adventure game from the Super NES. I've also provided a link to go to Florian's Azar Games page on My Mini Factory because he has all of these tiles on sale for a pretty reasonable price. So all of these files that you see that are presented here, and there's even some that I didn't print out, those are available just for $22 US. You get a ton of different buildings, trees. You get this cool thorny ground passageway, these rocks, this egg. I mean, there's just a ton of different stuff that you're getting just for $22. So that it's relatively cheap to do that. But not only does he have this sort of fantasy set, he also has a sci-fi set. He has games and rules that he's produced to be able to use with these different tiles. One that looks really cool is a modern day tactical warfare game, which again, I haven't played any of those games, but the terrain is super cool looking, and the little tanks and even miniatures that he provides is awesome. So this would be fantastic if you have younger kids that you want to get them into gaming, or, you know, in this case, just if they're familiar with playing just video games or things on their Switch, this is sort of a live way to just play around, set up different adventures, and that would be awesome too. And if you have a resin printer, you can print out the miniatures that he provides, which are also cute and chibi related too. Oh, I forgot to mention that one of the files that I heavily modified is the crystal tile that you get from him. And I did quite a bit of work in order to drill a hole. And again, I'm using balloon lights, which I mentioned in my previous video, which is a cheap and fantastic way to provide lighting to any of your terrain. And modified this pretty heavily, printed out the crystal part in clear PLA, and then took out the supports, and this is the result. I am pretty darn happy with how this turned out. I also love this little garden patch here for all of your farming simulation games. You can add that to this as well. So again, just super fun and interesting, and your kids would be able to play with this set and have a lot of fun too. So Dungeon Blocks is going to be coming out with their next iteration after a successful campaign of providing a dungeon set. Their next set is going to be a sewer set. I will be printing those out as well and creating a video. But in the meantime, maybe you have your favorite set that you want to adapt to Dungeon Blocks. And this is an example of how I did that, at least with the Azar Games more 16-bit fantasy game setting. Hopefully this is an inspiration to you. Go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe, as I'm going to continue to come out with other videos regarding games and 3D printing. In the meantime, happy printing, happy gaming. We'll see you soon.